All right, we're still on lesson 2.14. This is the part 3 video, trying to get through our reading here. And we left off at the top of page 660. In 1924, nativist sentiment took the force of law when Congress passed the Immigration Act, also known as the National Origins Act, which limited the number of aliens the United States would accept from any country in a given year. The law banned Japanese and Chinese immigrants altogether and set such low numbers for Southeastern Europeans they were effectively banished for the next 20 years. The great wave of immigration that had begun in the 1820s drew to an abrupt halt. And you can see here in the graph, European immigration, the red is Southeastern and European nations, and look how it totally dropped off there in the 1920s. And Northern and Western Europeans, how that changed significantly as well. Okay, Sacco and Vanzanetti. In Massachusetts in 1920, nativism mixed with Red's fear. Let me start over. In Massachusetts in 1920, nativism mixed with Red Scare fear of radicalism in the case of two Italian immigrants, Niccolo Sacco and Bartholomew Vanzetti. The two men were arrested 3 weeks after the actual crime for murdering a security guard and a payroll clerk during the robbery of a shoe factory in the town of South Braintree. They were tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. The trial and conviction aroused tremendous controversy. Sacco and Vanzanetti were members of an Italian anarchist group. Neither had a criminal record, but they had been active in labor strikes and anti-war efforts. Sacco's lawyer, Fred H. Moore, known for his role in the defense in cases against the radical industrial workers of the world, argued that Sacco and Vanzetti were convicted not on the basis of hard evidence, but because of their political radicalism. Here's the two pictures of the men. Moore used the media to stir up controversy. The case received national attention and provoked heated debate as new evidence and arguments emerged during appeals after the trial. The trial split public opinion. Some supported the verdict while others condemned the trial as a gross injustice. Felix Frankfurter, a professor of law at Harvard and a future Supreme Court justice, wrote in the Atlantic Monthly, a popular and respected magazine, that facts have been disclosed and not denied by the prosecution to indicate the case against these Italians for murder was part of a collusive effort between the district attorney and agents of the Department of Justice to rid the country of Sacco and Vanzanetti because of their red activities. Frankfurter's article was scorned as vicious propaganda by William Howard Taft, the former president and now Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Sacco and Vanzetti were executed on August 23, 1927. They maintained their innocence to the day they died. While historians remain uncertain about their guilt, the controversy surrounding their deaths reflects the volatile mix of anti-radical and anti-foreign feeling in America in the 1920s. Prohibition. And here we go. Let's look at the picture. Prohibition, the 18th Amendment, banned the manufacture and sale of alcohol. Here, an officer destroys kegs of beer. Prohibition. Nativist sentiments by the 1920s were partly behind the drive for prohibition, the total ban of the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages. The prohibition movement had its roots in the temperance movement of the early 19th century. Remember we read about those moral reforms? Temperance, mental institutions. Here we go again, prohibition. In the Progressive Era, support for prohibition increased among middle-class women who hoped to clean up vice in the cities. Many rural and small-town Protestants also championed prohibition as a moral cause, a way to replace immoral and disruptive behavior with sobriety and restraint. In the 1920s, many prohibitionists explicitly associated disorderly, threatening behavior with the foreigners in America's increasingly diverse society. In their speeches and pamphlets, prohibitionists linked drunkenness to the German brewer or the impoverished Catholic slum dweller who stumbled out of urban saloons to impose violence and vice upon American cities. Prohibitionists, hoping to use the power of the central government to enforce social order, agitated for a constitutional amendment to ban the manufacture and sale of alcohol. Over opposition from labor and immigrant groups, in 1917, Congress adopted the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. The amendment outlawed the manufacture, sale, transportation, import, or export, but not possession or consumption of alcoholic beverages. The states ratified the amendment in January 1919. Congress then passed the Volstead Act, which allowed for enforcement of the 18th Amendment by imposing penalties on producers and sellers of liquor. Although many prohibitionists had assumed beer and wine would remain legal, Congress defined alcoholic beverage to mean any drink with more than 0.5% alcohol by volume. Prohibition initially brought a 30% drop in alcohol consumption, but not because citizens refused to break the law. Many gave up or cut back their drinking because illegal liquor was very expensive. Arguments over prohibition to some extent divided along the side lines of city versus country. Residents of the South and the rural Midwest generally supported prohibition. City dwellers generally opposed it. Almost as soon as prohibition became law, Americans found ways around it. Bootleggers made illegal alcohol or smuggled in liquor from overseas. Some passed off poisonous rubbing alcohol or iodine as bourbon or whiskey. Americans across the country began to brew their own beer and distill moonshine whiskey. In many cities, people visited speakeasies, bars that operated in secret. By the middle of the decade, violations of prohibition were so rampant that overworked federal agents could do little to enforce it. Prohibition gave a boost in organized crime in America. Organized crime existed in America well before Prohibition, but in the big cities, the fortunes to be made selling illegal liquor fostered the rise of crime syndicates of unprecedented size. Al Capone, known as Scarface, controlled organized crime in Chicago. Between 1920 and 1927, he put together a 60 million criminal empire, based largely on bootlegging and gambling. His hundreds of underlings bribed police, bar owners, and public officials. They also murdered rival gangsters. In 26 and 27, at least 130 gangland murders went unsolved in Cook County, Illinois. Capone was finally arrested in 1931 and jailed for tax evasion. In 1933, Prohibition ended when the 21st Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, repealing the 18th Amendment, the only constitutional amendment to ever be repealed. The reborn Ku Klux Klan. Here's a picture of a Klan rally. In the 20s, a rejuvenated Ku Klux Klan expanded its appeal and persecuted a new and longer list of enemies. The reborn KKK. On Thanksgiving night in 1915, a cross blazed atop a stone mountain in Georgia, marking the birth of a new Ku Klux Klan, modeled after the organization that had persecuted African Americans in the Reconstruction-era South. The new Klan continued to attack blacks, but also widened its list of enemies to include the targets of nativism in the 20s, Catholics, Jews, and immigrants. Calling itself the militant wing of Protestantism, the KKK announced a crusade to rid America of its social and moral decay by establishing 100% Americanism. By 1925, the Klan had attracted an estimated 5 million members, mostly from the South, Southwest, and Midwest. Although sometimes dismissed as a band of backwoods extremists, the Klan proved as popular in the city as in the country, with large followings in Los Angeles, Chicago, Denver, Detroit, and Atlanta. It counted many businessmen, professionals, and ministers among its members. The broad appeal of the Ku Klux Klan revealed just how many Americans were troubled by the changes in American society, and how willing they were to blame immigrants and others associated with un-American ways. At the height of its power, the Klan controlled local politics in Indiana, Oklahoma, Colorado, and Texas. In other parts of the country, local groups organized boycotts of Catholic or Jewish-owned businesses. Often the Klan's chief weapon was violence. Klansmen murdered a Catholic priest in Alabama and burned a Catholic church in Illinois. In Alabama, Klansmen flogged a black woman and whipped an immigrant for marrying a native citizen. In their book, Militant, the Linds wrote that the KKK afforded an outlet for many of the constant frustrations of life, economic tension, and social insecurity, by providing a wealth of scapegoats against whom wrath might be vented. By the middle of the decade, however, most Americans began to realize the Klan was inciting disorder rather than fighting it. When a prominent Klansman was convicted in 1925 of the rape and second-degree murder of a state employee, the corruption and hypocrisy of the organization came to national attention. Its influence declined over the next year. The Scopes Trial. In 1925, the clash of values of the United States took center stage in a courtroom in Tennessee. In what would become one of the most famous trials of the century, the long-standing tensions between religion and science, sacred and secular, city and country, entered the courtroom in the national consciousness. The state of Tennessee, like other southern states, outlawed the teaching of the theory of evolution in public school classrooms. In 1925, John Scopes, a high school biology teacher in the town of Dayton, deliberately violated the law in order to test it in court. Scopes was supported by the American Civil Liberties Union. Among the most ardent supporters of the Tennessee law were Protestant fundamentalists who emphasized a literal interpretation of the Bible. Fundamentalists blame Charles Darwin's theory of evolution for pulling Americans away from God by contradicting the account of the creation in the book of Genesis. Many fundamentalists resided in the rural South. In the courtroom in Dayton, Tennessee, the trial took shape as a battle between science and religion. Representing Scopes was Clarence Darrow, the nation's most famous defense attorney who had previously defended labor unions and radicals. Arguing for the prosecution was William Jennings Bryan, the three-time Democratic presidential nominee and former Secretary of State. Remember, he gave the Cross of Gold speech? Bryan himself was a fundamentalist Christian, declared that the trial would be a duel to the death. The trial became a media spectacle. Hundreds of journalists were on hand, including radio reporters who delivered live broadcasts as the trial unfolded. Darrow and Bryan argued the validity of the law that Scopes had broken, and they debated the validity of evolution and the fundamentalist view of creation. At the trial's most dramatic moment, Darrow unexpectedly called Bryan to the stand as an expert on various topics in the Bible, including the account of creation. Darrow tried to trap Bryan into admitting Bible was not literal truth. Darrow maneuvered Bryan into conceding the 7 days described in Genesis might not have been 24-hour periods, but rather long historical eras. In doing so, Bryan implied that some interpretation was necessary to understand the Bible. In the end, Scopes was found guilty and fined $100. The trial was no victory for fundamentalists, however, because the media coverage had largely scorned Bryan, his arguments, and his supporters. Reflecting the urban bias of much of the reporting, H.L. Mencken, who wrote bitterly mocking reports for the Baltimore Sun, referred to the people of Dayton as yokels and ignoramuses. About Bryan, Mencken wrote, he seemed only a poor clod like those around him, deluded by childless theology. Fundamentalist revivals. The fundamentalist movement, a part of evangelical Protestantism, stood firmly opposed to the modernism of the 20s. The movement gained its greatest popularity in the South and Southwest, where hundreds of churches sprang up as fundamentalist preachers attracted new congregations. Two of the most effective of these preachers were Billy Sunday and Aimee Semple McPherson. Billy Sunday, a successful professional baseball player who quit the game to devote his life to preaching, mesmerized audiences at enormous tent revivals around the country. A tremendous showman, Sunday rallied against drinking, gambling, and the changing role of women. He scorned evolution as jackass nonsense. Aimee Semple McPherson, a dramatic speaker known for faith healing, embraced new technology to reach her audience. An extraordinary fundraiser, she built a 5,000-seat temple where she preached nightly and broadcast sermons on her own radio station. Oh, I should have, didn't miss some here. Bryan died in his sleep 5 days later after the trial. With his passing, the fundamentalist movement lost a powerful voice, but the movement would soon persist and intensify its efforts in the coming decades. And here we go. The Scopes trial with pitted Clarence Darrow left against William Jennings Bryan here on the right dramatized a clash of values. And it was also a bitterly hot summer, and that's why he's holding a fan there, because it was a bitterly hot summer while they had that court case going on, the Scopes monkey trial. So we are going to stop here for the 214 lesson. So we're stopping here for the 214 lesson. Make sure that you fill out as much as you can with your reading guide, the Roaring 20 sheet. Remember, the lesson answer key can be found in lesson 2.15, and we will finish the rest of the reading for this chapter in the Roaring 20s in the next lesson. So enjoy and have a good day.